Hi, I'm Dennis Cuevas, Director of the CLE program at the DC Bar. We hope you're enjoying this virtual conference marking the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. This session, We Can Do It, How Pro Bono Lawyers Are Shaping the Voting Rights Landscape, is eligible for CLE credit in all states that have continuing legal education requirements. An alphanumeric code will be read out loud and displayed sometime during the presentation. Please take the time to write down the code. Within the next 24 hours, those of you who have registered and paid for CLE credit will receive an email with a link where you will then identify the correct codes to receive credit. As we enter our busy season with many state CLE deadlines fast approaching, please allow up to 30 days to process your certificate of completion. Also, in that same email, there will be an electronic evaluation form. Please take the time to complete the evaluation. We need a number of them back for accreditation purposes, but more importantly, we review them carefully as we always look for ways to improve our classes. If you have any questions about obtaining CLE credit, please send an email to cle@dcbar.org and we'll be happy to assist you. If you're watching this pre-recorded program during the live broadcast, please feel free to pose any questions you have in the chat room, since our presenters will be available to answer any questions that you have. So, without further ado, let me turn it over to our distinguished speakers. Enjoy the program.
Thanks, Dennis, for those administrative announcements, and a big thank you to the DC Bar for hosting this panel. With the election only a couple of weeks away, it's pretty easy to see why this panel is so important and timely right now. I have an amazing group of attorneys joining me to talk about all things voting rights and pro bono related. We'll cover different voting rights issues and nonpartisan pro bono needs, how to start working on voting pro bono, whether at your firm or as an individual, and share some success stories of pro bono attorneys making a difference in this area. I hope that at the end of the panel, you will not only be motivated to get involved, but that you'll have some concrete ways to do so as well. With that, I'd like to briefly introduce myself and the panelists. I'm Ashley Erickson. I'm the Director of Network Advancement at the American Constitution Society, where I oversee our pro bono efforts, and a big part of that includes voting rights pro bono work. Through that work, I also sit on the Council for All Voting is Local, a coalition project that's housed at the Leadership Conference, as well as with one of our panelists here, Jonathan Diaz. And next, I will introduce Nancy Anderson, who is the Director of Pro Bono at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Nancy is responsible for the overall design, structure, strategy, and implementation of impact civil rights projects, which utilize pro bono resources, technology, on-the-ground support, and legal assistance. In addition, she works with over 100 national law firms and corporate legal departments to find pro bono counsel to assist and staff on all lawyers committee matters, including impact and class litigation, amicus briefs, research matters, mega projects, and public policy. And that includes a lead role in election protection, the nation's largest nonpartisan voter protection program. Up next is Jonathan Diaz, who is legal counsel over voting rights at the Campaign Legal Center. Jonathan's work focuses on overcoming barriers to accessing the ballot, including issues related to local election administration, absentee and mail voting, the census, and the intersection of elections and the criminal justice system. He litigates voting rights cases in federal courts across the United States and advocates for laws and policies to expand access to the ballot at federal, state, and local levels. He also frequently provides public education and commentary on voting rights issues, and recently joined CNN as an election law analyst for the 2020 election cycle. Now, completing our panel is Susie Turner, who is a partner and chair of Decker's firm-wide pro bono practice, which provides legal representation to individuals and organizations that otherwise could not afford it. Her practice involves a wide range of human rights and civil rights litigation. Throughout her career, Susie has been active in many organizations focused on access to justice and civil rights issues. Currently, she is co-chair of the board of PILNet and a board member of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And from 2005 to 2009, she served as a member of the American Bar Association Standing Committee on Pro Bono and Public Service. She also formally chaired the Philadelphia Bar Association's Public Interest and Pro Bono sections. So without further ado, let's jump into this panel. I know we're all really excited to talk about this today. So Assuming that those who are joining us today are obviously interested in doing voting pro bono rights work and likely aren't experts in this area, I thought it would be helpful to start with a brief overview and a grounding of why voting rights work is so essential and why there's a need for pro bono in this area. So I'm going to tee this up to Jonathan on our panel to sort of give us a 30,000-foot overview of this area.
Sure. Thanks, Ashley. So what I think a lot of people don't realize about voting rights work and election administration in particular, if you haven't had a chance to work on these issues directly, is that we don't have one election in this country every 2 years. We have thousands and thousands of elections all across the country administered at not just the state, but the county and local level. The decisions that are made that affect who can vote and how they can vote do really take place on the local and county level. And so litigation to protect voters' rights to exercise their right to vote and to cast their ballots really take place in sort of a patchwork way across the country every year. And so that's why organizations like CLC and the Lawyers Committee and our pro bono partners are so busy all the time, not just now in the lead up to a general election. And so voting rights litigation takes a number of different forms. There can be, large cases that focus on the structure of our elections, things like redistricting cases. Other cases deal with who can vote. Whether that is cases involving felony disenfranchisement and the administration of those policies, when people regain their right to vote if they lose it due to a felony conviction, whether students are able to vote on campus, who is eligible to vote by mail, increasingly important in this election cycle. And then I would say the majority of voting rights litigation, at least that we work on, has to do with how people vote. And the administrative process by which people can request a ballot, cast a ballot, when they can do that, and how to make sure that those ballots are counted. So this year, in particular, like many things, the COVID-19 pandemic has really upended election administration and ballot access across the country. And so there's been a lot of focus on policies that make it easier or harder to vote by mail or vote absentee. Things like witness signature requirements or the timing by which you have to return your absentee ballot. All of those details and the potential burdens that they place on the right to vote are the subject of litigation. Not just in the hotly contested swing states that we hear about all the time in places like Florida and Pennsylvania, but really across the country.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. That leads really into what I want to talk about next. Obviously, things are a little different than this year than they have been in the past, and all of you have different areas of expertise in this area. Can we talk a little bit about what are some of the areas with immediate needs right now? Seeing as we're in the midst of a pandemic, we've been dealing with a lot of racial justice issues this summer as well that have really, become at the forefront of people's minds. And what are some of those immediate needs where help is really needed at the moment?
Well, I'm happy to jump in there. Hi, everyone. I'm Nancy Anderson, the Director of Pro Bono with the Lawyers Committee. And thanks so much to the DC Bar for having me on the panel. I really appreciate it. And also just focusing on voting rights generally. It's just, it sounds silly, but it's such a critical component of our democracy. In terms of immediate needs for lawyers being involved in voting rights work, the need is broad, yet, we'll have to see where everything goes. So in terms of election protection, we currently are utilizing legal volunteers to help answer the National Voter Hotline, which is, again, part of the Election Protection Coalition. Trained legal volunteers are taking calls every day from voters across the country and answering such, it used to be a basic question, where do I vote? Not so basic anymore. To also trying to help voters get through the massive confusion on vote by mail. the amount of lawsuits that are still ongoing and the changes that are happening with local election administration is just mind-blowing. And it is so difficult for folks to stay on top of that. So these volunteers are helping answering those voters' questions. In addition, come election day, lots of poll monitors are needed across the country. Even though states will have significantly increased vote by mail, those states are still having in-person voting, even those with high vote by mail turnout. And in those few polling places open, there will be long lines, there will be problems. So poll monitors play a critical role in being able to observe those problems and report them up to the National Voter Hotline, at least for election protection. They also, are able to help voters on site and answer questions. So those folks are also needed. And of course, folks are generally outside in most states. Poll monitors, that's opposed to poll workers, who are the folks who are utilized by the local election administration officials to be in the polls, checking voters in. The poll monitors are usually on the outside, and they're reporting problems. But the poll monitors, again, in most states are outside and can socially distance. And if I had my little handy dandy election protection mask, if you volunteer for election protection, they'll have a mask and a t-shirt. But those are two big needs. And then of course, the big uncertainty is litigation. But I don't know if the other panelists want to jump in.
If I can add just one thing to what Nancy said, all of the, the needs that she just described are not just election day needs. They're in fact already happening as we record this. It's September 29th today. And over 1 million votes have already been cast. So the election has already started. November 3rd is not when the election begins, it's when the election ends. And so, we need people to serve as poll monitors and to staff the election protection hotline and to really get involved, now. And, when you're watching this on, I think it's October 20th, it's not too late. There is still a huge need for volunteers and for people to participate in all of these things.
And Susie, on the firm side, have you noticed that there have been an increase of asks that have come of lawyers to get involved with these issues or in a different way than they have in the past?
Absolutely. I mean, at Deckert, we've been sort of involved in sort of election voting related issues for the last 15, 20 years. And we actually have a pro bono practice group that's focused on voting rights cases. So we continuously do this, but I'm getting deluged this year with requests from our attorneys to be engaged with the cases that we're taking on. And right now we have 10 active cases and an overwhelming number of people who are signing up for the hotline, as well as volunteering to be poll workers and poll watchers. So there is increased interest and engagement all across the board.
And I like that everyone pointed out some different ways that there are available to get involved. I know a lot of people, when they think about this type of work, the first thing they think about is, impact litigation. But there are a lot of different ways to get involved. We've heard some things like helping with hotlines, working with election protection. Are there other types of voting pro bono that we should be talking about, other ways for people to get involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously the first thing that comes to mind, like you said, are the big, cases that, maybe affect an entire state or, may change the rules in some kind of drastic way in the run up to an election. But I think equally important are the smaller cases, on election day. I grew up in Florida, and so I am always thinking about how election day intersects with the end of hurricane season and natural disasters, coming in and disrupting election day operations. It's usually election protection or, some kind of pro bono advocate who goes to court to get a TRO to extend polling place hours in a county or two so that people can make it to the polls. And that doesn't get the same kind of press as, maybe some of the big vote by mail lawsuits that folks have heard about. But it's just as important to make sure that people can cast their ballots. And so, it's all kinds of stuff like that to make sure that even on, the small scale, whether it's a precinct or a county, people are able to vote.
Of course, the one thing that we haven't said is make sure that you vote. That everyone who's watching this and everyone that and who are eligible to vote actually votes. And so my personal preference, if you don't have a pre-existing condition, is to vote early and vote in person. I could go on and on about the vote by mail challenges that we're looking at and that this country will be facing. But anyway, make sure you vote. And for some of you watching this, there still will be, I don't know about the immediate DC area. I can't remember all the voter registration deadlines, but certainly there are many states in the country who even have same day voter registration. So even if it's past your voter registration deadline, you may have a family member or a friend elsewhere who can still register to vote and vote.
Thank you for mentioning how important it is for everyone to just vote as well. Another important thing that people can always think about doing is becoming a poll worker if you feel comfortable as well. I know there are critical shortages around the country, and some places as well are offering CLD for attorneys to become poll workers. So the next question I wanted to talk about is, who can get involved in voting rights pro bono? You know, are you only looking for people with a certain background, with a certain set of skills? Is it really available for a wide range of people?
Well, I'll jump in since we're looking for volunteers. To staff the National Voter Hotline, you do need to be a legal volunteer. So that would be a lawyer, paralegal, or law student. As part of the Election Protection Coalition, to volunteer in the field as a poll monitor on election day or for early voting, any type of volunteer can participate. So you don't have to have that, quote unquote, legal training. That's being run through our coalition partner, Common Cause, and all of our state and local coalition partners. And I would encourage volunteers for that aspect to go to protectthevote.net. For the National Voter Hotline, and I believe we may share this information later, you would go to electionprotection.wetheaction.org. There is another opportunity that I did not mention, although we're still trying to figure this out. And, I assume that most folks watching this will be in the DC metropolitan area. I could be wrong, of course. But the Lawyers Committee and our coalition partners are building out a legal rapid response network. We're trying to identify lawyers across the country who can be available on or around Election Day to help file litigation if it's needed. These folks in particular, we're not asking them to go out and draft long briefs and try to become a voting rights expert at the last minute, but to help us be local counsel, obtain declarations if we need it, potentially even go to court. We have the DMV area covered, so if you're here, then we're good. But thank you for your interest. But if by chance you're living somewhere else and are admitted to court there and are watching this, you can definitely just reach out to me, and you can find my email on the Lawyers Committee website.
And I mean, in terms of pro bono litigation opportunities, even after Election Day, even though it's hard, I think, for most of us to think past that point right now, voting rights litigation takes place year round. Many of the emergency lawsuits that will be filed in the run-up or immediate aftermath of this election will continue to be litigated through 2021 and even maybe beyond. And so we are constantly looking for pro bono partners across the country, primarily litigators, folks with civil litigation experience. Doesn't have to be voting or election related. And I mean, the biggest benefit to me as a DC-based, voting litigator, to working with local pro bono counsel is honestly just a familiarity with the area and the culture and the legal culture and the regular culture of your communities. And we work with a lot of firms from the DMV area who have offices out in the rest of the 50 states and Puerto Rico. And so just knowing the judges are and what their pet peeves are is helpful. And just the ways things are done in your jurisdictions where you are admitted to practice, where you have experience, is hugely beneficial to us we have the subject matter expertise, but maybe not, maybe we don't know how things are done in a particular courtroom or in a particular jurisdiction.
And building on that, I'm so glad that you mentioned post-election day. What we're all facing in 2021. redistricting. And so I know the Lawyers Committee and other organizations will be reaching out to law firms and lawyers to assist us with that, in part because we're going to be supporting local partners who are working at the state and local level on their redistricting efforts. And lawyers can help play a critical role in helping us train our grassroots organizations as they work on these redistricting plans, and also help them draft letters and potential testimony to be submitted to their either state legislature or local governing body. And because, Jonathan, even as you mentioned at the beginning, and it's interesting because so many folks focus on the presidential election or the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, but your school board election could actually play a much bigger role in your life than the president, potentially. So it's just so critical that the redistricting effort moves forward in a fair way, and that communities are able to elect candidates of their choice. And that's certainly one thing as a civil rights group that we will be focusing on. So just wanted to flag that, and I'm so glad you reminded us there will be a post-election.
And in terms of, both of you brought up this important point of opportunities post-election, and then, needs in different locations as well. And I know, Susie, not only do you work in this area, but you also coordinate across the country. What if there are people who are watching this and, really want to get involved with litigation, but may not live, in DC? There might not be the particular issue where they want to get involved in, they want to get involved in another state. Do you see that happening at your firm, where attorneys from all over are, working on cases in different localities, on teams, those sorts of things?
We have some people from our DC office working on these cases, but in point of fact, we have people from multiple offices working on these cases. And especially now, during this particular moment in time where so much is remote, we have more multi-office teams than ever. We were handling a case in Tennessee back in August where the oral argument before the Tennessee Supreme Court was by Zoom. And so, our attorney in Chicago sat there in her living room, making her oral argument. So indeed, in most of these cases have our staff sort of cross office. And we have people engaged in from virtually all of our offices in the United States.
Now, what about if someone's interested in getting involved, but they have no prior experience in this area? Is training available for different opportunities?
Well, I can speak to that. Because we rely obviously on our community partners, which are many in this area, not only to help us, respond and set strategy, but also to help train us. And hopefully, for election protection, they have it down to a science in terms of being able to easily access training in modules and get up to speed on what you need to do. And you can watch the training multiple times if technologically it feels challenging. In terms of more substantive voting rights cases, the big pieces of litigation, I think we of course partner, with civil liberties groups who help us. We've done so many of these cases. We have some internal expertise at this time, but we'll never think for a moment that we're not as good as our community partner, who is some learning by doing and some internal expertise. So we've, as I mentioned before, have built up an internal voting rights practice. So we keep layering on and bringing into the fold new partners and new associates all the time. So we have developed some expertise and some arguably efficiencies and economies of scale. But if you haven't done one of these cases before, which was us 15 years ago, it is definitely never too late to learn, and definitely never too late to get up to speed.
So can we dig into the nuts and bolts of that a little bit more? So say someone is watching this and they want to get involved and they're wondering how they can start a pro bono practice in their area at their firm, or maybe it's in-house somewhere else. Do you have tips and tricks for someone who really wants to start getting involved with larger scale things and how to organize that?
Well, for me at Deckard, it was finding one or two champions, partners who really were interested in this area. And sort of running with it. In point of fact, one of our first voting rights cases was the Texas voter ID case, where our partner at the time was Ezra Rosenberg. And he took the lead from the Deckard perspective in working with a large coalition of groups. He is now co-chair of the voting rights practice at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. So it was because of Ezra's enthusiasm, which he then transmitted to Neil Steiner, one of my other partners. And Neil has helped build out a group of people who are interested, who come back time and time again. And there are 2 or 3 areas which we I wouldn't say specialize, which we tend to focus on. We've done a lot of motor voter cases, ensuring, ease of registration. We have done a lot of voter ID cases. So for example, we've done voter ID cases in Texas and Wisconsin, and most recently in Kansas. And then we do voter purge cases to ensure that the voter rolls aren't purged, even in between elections. And then obviously there's the COVID related issues that have cropped up this year in terms of sort of accessing absentee or mail-in ballots, in some states curbing or culling the number of polling places that are available. So we've been fighting to ensure polling places stay open, and then all the sort of voter identification issues that are coming along with it. So lots of issues out there, but we found it best to sort of specialize in 2 or 3. We haven't been doing the redistricting yet, but I hear Nancy's call, so hopefully we'll respond. And we haven't done gerrymandering cases. So, we've kept in certain lanes so we can get good at them.
I think from a process perspective, Susie kind of nailed it, in that it's really about developing personal relationships and just reaching out and talking to people and relying on the networks you already have. So, before coming to CLC, I was at a law firm, and many of my current colleagues, also made the jump from private practice to our little nonprofit. And so we reached back out to our previous colleagues from past jobs, co-counsel from other cases that are maybe totally unrelated to voting, when we need pro bono assistance. And we've had, people, law firm partners, law firm associates reach out to us after events like this, panels and, happy hours and conferences and things like that. We are always looking for help, because there is more than enough work to go around. And so it is, the people that we go to first are the ones who reach out to us directly, and who show the most interest and who say, hey, we really want to work on this. We are available. We have people in these, 5 states. Let us know if anything comes up. And so it really is just about, making the connections, and talking to the people who are also interested in doing this work. I got my start in this field doing a pro bono case, as a new associate at a law firm, and I knew nothing about voting rights and election law. And now it's all I do. So the opportunities are there. You just have to grab them.
Sorry about that. I'll sort of do not a little bit of the devil's advocate. I always get these phrases wrong, but one thing, so definitely, knowing and reaching out to organizations, but I will admit one of my pet peeves is when people reach out to me and they're like, hey, I want a case that's going to go to the Supreme Court. I want that, big, sexy issue that's in the news. That the work is, we've got a lot of work, but you're not always going to get those cases, and we don't always necessarily have them. We definitely don't always have them sitting around. So if you're really interested in building a voting rights practice within your firm for pro bono, don't think that you're going to start, up here at the Supreme Court case, but that the best way to make and establish and reinforce these positive relationships with, our organizations is volunteer to take on research, on voting rights research. If there's a matter that goes out, do a good job on it. I can't tell you how many, I love the law firms, but I can't tell you how often we get that sort of basic research back and it's not good because the partner or whoever didn't really, review it, didn't take it seriously, or, I don't know, but that even happened today with something we just got back. So make sure there's a good product, get it back in a timely way, continue to take on those kind of matters. And I can promise you, the firms that do a good job on those, I'm reaching back out to them all the time. And the other thing is that, the Lawyers Committee, we try to work with a broad range of law firms, but there's no question that once we know a firm has developed some expertise, that the partner that we're working with in all honesty, plays well in the sandbox with not just us, but with other coalition partners, because I can promise you there's all kinds of coalition politics or just challenges when you're working with a lot of folks. We'll reach out to them when we've got to file something the next day. I mean, we've certainly done that with Deckert a number of times because, oh my gosh, this is this issue. We literally, I think they helped us just a month ago file something in 2 days. And we knew that they would deliver. So again, start with the bottom, do a good job, reach out, you know, and you'll definitely be able to build up a practice and get that flow of work coming your way. And great appreciation from the public interest groups.
Nancy, let me echo that research potential. I mean, that is, and again, is another way for people to be engaged in voting rights work without having to file something in 2 days and taking on a major piece of litigation. I mean, some of the pieces of litigation last years. I mean, we're involved in a Wisconsin voter ID case. It's been going on since 2011. So, you know, a bit of a snapshot of research, especially if you guys need it, is a very easy way for someone to be engaged, feeling a part of a larger whole, but also make it very manageable.
And it helps to build that capacity and expertise that we talked about for the next time.
Yeah, definitely building a reputation, you know, between both partners is really important. What about if someone is watching this who isn't at a firm? What if they're an attorney, you know, in-house somewhere else? What if they're not practicing? Are there opportunities for them as well?
Well, certainly doing the election protection, either National Voter Hotline or poll monitoring work, we do need that. It's harder for the Lawyers Committee just because we get so much interest in our work that, you know, I often work just directly with our board members or in many cases, at least initially, with the pro bono counsel at the firms. So I'm not the best to give advice on that. Maybe Jonathan or Susie, you guys have some thoughts? Again, outside of election protection.
Yeah, I think outside of the sort of rapid response election protection realm, there are definitely opportunities for people in solo practice, especially some of my best partners in cases that I'm working on right now are retired or semi-retired attorneys who have left private practice, but who still feel very passionately about these issues and, you know, want to be involved in, you know, they're not working a full-time schedule anymore, and the work that they do, they want it to be this. And, you know, they've gotten involved with these cases in a similar way as I described earlier, just, you know, working with, you know, previous colleagues, you know, leaning on their connections, getting involved in their own communities. Either they've done some election protection or have, you know, worked on, say, an independent redistricting commission initiative or something like that. And, you know, have proven themselves to be a reliable partner in the trenches, you know, getting petitions signed or, you know, monitoring local election board proceedings and things like that. And really developing the relationships and the subject matter expertise to then, when they see something, you know, some issue that they think, you know, hey, I'm not a voting rights expert, but this seems fishy to me, bringing it to our attention and then getting in on the ground floor. We've had that happen in a couple of cases in, you know, Alabama and Georgia, most recently, where, you know, longtime, you know, civil litigators who are not affiliated with big firms, you know, just noticed something that they thought was not right, and brought it to our attention or to, you know, colleagues of theirs at big firms in their areas who now we're all working together on those cases.
That is actually true. We have had a former government lawyer who, when he retired, he wanted to focus on voting rights work. And it's been, I don't know, 3 years that he has worked part-time as a senior fellow, volunteering, and is one of our biggest experts on something related to voting. And of course, I can't remember it right now. But, you know, for folks who have lots of time and lots of interest, most public interest groups are understaffed compared to the amount of work that we have to do. And that is the case moving forward. So if you have a lot of time to give, we love that kind of help.
Thanks to both of you for that. I would really love to open up some space to hear about success stories about working with pro bono partners, or Susie, in your experience working on pro bono cases, and how you really feel like this pro bono work is making an impact in this area.
Well, it's always hard to measure impact, but I think we're happy when we get the successes. But I'm most excited about some of the partnerships that we've developed over time, and watching young associates at the firm come in and doing their first voting rights case, and then continue to come back to doing it. So I consider that an internal success, that we have been, I don't want to say a training ground, but at least a place for a lot of our associates to be able to be engaged in these matters, even if they're not working at the Lawyers Committee or sort of in the trenches, so to speak, but they can still be in a large law firm and feel like they're contributing to the all-important right to vote. And so I constantly get feedback from our associates. People don't always say thank you, but I get a lot of thank yous, like thank you for enabling us to be engaged, even though we're at a for-profit organization whose mission is not to solely promote civil liberties. And they really, and then there are obviously the cases. One of our big victories, hopefully it will remain that way, is in Kansas, with respect to Chris Kobach and the draconian voter identification rules that he wanted to put in place. Just to be able to be with our community partners and fight those battles when they arise, it feels great to be able to do that.
Well, and I can say, I think, I can't remember now, but we may have 7 staff attorneys who are completely focused on voting rights litigation, maybe 6, I don't know. But they filed 29 cases this year, and they never would have been able to do that if we weren't co-counseling with law firms, right? So, by doing this pro bono work, you're enabling the substantive experts to really leverage that expertise, right? I mean, 29 is unheard of, but seriously, we wouldn't have been able to come anywhere near that. And you lose some, but then you win some. So just alone by providing that assistance, you're allowing some of these cases to win and move forward on better election administration, even if your own case doesn't win. But
yeah, it's hard for me to think of any case that I've worked on, this year or in the past several, that didn't have, a law firm partner. Because especially for us at CLC, we don't have, chapters across the country in every other state. We are just, there's 40 of us in DC and that's it. And so we really, really rely on our pro bono partners in other jurisdictions to even be able to file any of our lawsuits. And then, there are, countless examples in places like, Pennsylvania and Minnesota and Florida recently where, we got positive outcomes either through settlements or through, consent orders or actual judgments that would never have been possible without the extra capacity that we got from our law firm partners and the expertise that they brought to the table, whether that was, substantive in some cases when folks had a lot of voting rights experience, or just, litigation skills and strategy and, knowing the ins and outs of federal civil litigation and their courts in particular. One example that comes to mind is we represented Common Cause and the League of Women Voters of Rhode Island in a case earlier this year, challenging. Rhode Island had a requirement that you needed 2 witness signatures or a notary stamp if you were going to vote absentee. We and the ACLU partnered with Freed Frank to challenge that lawsuit, and it ended up actually going all the way up to the Supreme Court on an emergency stay application that we won. And the Supreme Court upheld the consent order that we reached with the Rhode Island Secretary of State. And the speed with which we had to put all of that together would have made it impossible without help from our pro bono partners.
Thanks so much for that, sharing all of that. hope that really motivates those who are watching to want to get involved. I mean, there's some really important ways that pro bono attorneys can get involved in lots of different ways. Since we are pre-recording this, I'm thinking of potential questions that could come up as people are watching. I know when this airs, we're going to be just a couple weeks away from Election Day. I'm anticipating there will probably be some questions about opportunities directly post-Election Day. I know we talked a little bit about that there's still opportunities to get involved right before the election, but I think a lot of us are anticipating that there will be some needs right after the election as well. Now, recognizing that we're focusing on nonpartisan opportunities, do you anticipate any pro bono needs, nonpartisan needs that will be the help that will be needed immediately after the election?
So the National Voter Hotline for Election Protection will be still up and running post-election day, because we do expect the call volume to remain, probably pretty darn high, just because of all the vote by mail that's taking place across the country. And I think that there will be still lots of questions about, did they get my ballot? I don't know if they got my ballot. They didn't count my ballot. What do I do? And also for those who vote provisionally, there's, a window of opportunity of when they can go back and provide their ID so that the vote switches to a regular ballot. However, by the time folks watch this, those shifts may be full. I don't know, but there will be that continued need, at least for a couple of weeks.
And, I think it's fair to assume that most, if not all, of the litigation that takes place immediately following the election will probably have a more partisan bent than some of the stuff that we typically work on. At that point, it really is often, I think, the parties and the campaigns, sort of squabbling about outcomes. But what our role has typically been in cases like that, and as is already in cases that we're participating in now, is we will often intervene on behalf of nonpartisan groups like the League or like Common Cause to present the court, whether we are intervening as a party or as amicus, to present courts that are adjudicating these disputes with a nonpartisan sort of voter-centered perspective, to try and take the temperature down and remove these disputes from the left versus right partisan framing that they come with, and really make sure that the courts that are looking at these things are putting the voters first and making sure that all eligible voters' ballots are being counted in a way that complies with whatever the law of that jurisdiction is. And so hopefully, fingers crossed, we always hope that there are no shenanigans and no disputes after polls close, but that's unfortunately not always the case. And so I think that there will probably be opportunities for people to get involved with, these things pop up. We don't always get a heads up when a lawsuit is going to be filed that we want to intervene in or file an amicus brief in. And so it's good for us to have these contacts now, so we can reach out to people with tight turnarounds, and put something really powerful in front of the court.
And Susie, I don't know if you've been having similar conversations about post-election day contingencies, ways that you can get involved at the firm as well.
Haven't really yet, but it's been great to hear from Nancy and Jonathan to hear what some of the opportunities might be. Because again, from the law firm perspective, we really do rely on the expertise of those organizations that are in the trenches. And we're excited to be able to help them leverage what they do, but we don't pretend to be on the front line in doing it. So we will reach out and offer our assistance, but we look for the call too, to give us direction on where we can best deploy our resources.
Yeah, and I think a good plug as well to always encourage people is the more that people get involved pre-election day, hopefully the fewer things that we'll have to worry about post-election day. Hopefully there will be still some opportunities if someone watching isn't already involved, that maybe they can get involved by election day. We should have some resources that we'll be able to share, whether in the chat when this airs, or some links that we can share out. I'm just thinking about different things that we can reiterate about ways that people can get involved pre-election. Nancy, in terms of that, I know part of your capacity is going to be, closer to the time, seeing what the needs are. But are there historic needs that you typically have, even in the couple of weeks leading up to Election Day?
There's always something that we need inevitably, right? This is an interesting election cycle for so many reasons. But so for this year, the National Voter Hotline is operating remotely for the first time ever, which has changed the dynamic in terms of volunteers, because before the Lawyers Committee would run the National Voter Hotline out of our office in DC up to 2 days before the election, and then it would be run out of law firms across the country and staffed by volunteers from those cities. But because it's virtual, anyone anywhere in the country can volunteer. So in the past, at this point, I would be banging on doors like, please come back to our call center, please come back to our call center. But because it's remote, I haven't had to do that. And, we are extremely grateful for the over 22,000 volunteers who have already signed up for the hotline this year. It's just a staggering number. And there will be an additional 6,000 that'll sign up by the time we're done with the election cycle. So what the one unknown is how high the call volume will be in advance of Election Day. Right now, we have 100 volunteers on staff at any time during the day, which they can handle about 2,500 calls during a day. We're still underneath that, but who knows? In 2 weeks, it could be 5,000. And so when you're watching this, it may be we're like, oh my God, we need a whole bunch more volunteers. So who knows? This is the great unknown 2020.
And if folks aren't motivated enough to volunteer and sign up just yet, one thing that we haven't really touched on so far is voter intimidation, which is also something that becomes increasingly important to monitor and to be prepared to respond to as we get closer to the election. So by the time you all are watching this, that's also something that election protection, that the hotline, answers calls for, and something that we are thinking a lot about, now, earlier on, how to respond, how to prepare, voters and the general public to know what to look for and know what to report. And so that's another thing that we, have litigated in the past, and like everything else, need local partners to be able to make sure that we prevent.
And that's a challenging issue because it's, there's a lot of early voting going on right now. So it's not necessarily that this will happen on Election Day, but could be happening anytime, as well as even at drop boxes for vote by mail. So, even though, again, there's lots of people voting absentee ballots or vote by mail, there's just so many ways things could not go the way that they should. And so it's great to have the volunteers to assist us as needed.
Yeah, and I know so much voter intimidation is also happening online, just considering the environment that we're in right now, the amount of misinformation, disinformation that is being spread through social media and other channels. And I know through the National Election Protection Coalition, there are some projects that are addressing that as well, where volunteers are getting trained to not only flag when they see misinformation and disinformation on social media, but to be trained to inoculate it, to have the resources to then make sure that they're sharing good information and good resources. And I think those who have legal training are even more helpful in that process. I think it's easier for us to spot those things when we see them. And so there are opportunities to get involved with that. And I'm sure that opportunity is going to continue post the election as well. And we should be able to share some more information about that. Now, I want to make sure that we end this conversation not thinking that, there's a couple more weeks or a few more months to get involved with voting and then it ends. I know, Jonathan, you started out this talking about the historical nature of these issues, that they are always present. And so can we talk just, a little bit about pro bono not in an election year, and what types of pro bono needs there always are, where pro bono help is always needed?
Sure. I would say it's the same exact kind of help that we need during an election year, just without the ticking time bomb of a November election day deadline. So some things that happen in non-election years, like Nancy mentioned earlier, redistricting will take place in 2021. And so something that we'll be monitoring is making sure that the new legislative boundaries at the congressional and the state legislative level are being drawn fairly, that they are, complying with federal law, that they're giving communities a chance to elect candidates of their choice, especially in states that are going to be doing this with independent redistricting commissions for the first time. So that's going to be a huge piece of our work in 2021. But then, in every, I hate to call it an off-cycle year because there really is no off-cycle, as I've learned doing this work. When there isn't a major election, state legislatures are still in session and they are passing laws, to change the election code, sometimes in good ways, sometimes in bad ways. And when they are changing in bad ways, we litigate. And several of the cases that I have been working on in the last few months actually date back to 2019 when some of these laws were passed, or early 2020. Secretaries of state and county election boards are issuing their election plans and election guidance and changing administrative rules during non-election years. And those are the kinds of things that can create headaches and can cause problems during the election year. And so we don't want to wait until September and October to start litigating those things. We want to challenge them as they happen, to give us time to go through the federal litigation process, or the state litigation process if it's a state court issue, so that we can get a resolution well in advance of the election. And I feel like I sound like a broken record, but to do all of those things, we really, really need local and pro bono partners.
I'm just going to interrupt briefly to give the MCLE code. Today's code is FR75. That is F as in Frank, R as in Robert, 75. And once more, F as in Frank, R as in Robert, 75.
Thanks. So Susie, I know you also mentioned that your firm has an established practice where you work on these sort of issues, and you mentioned you have cases that have been going on for years. How do you continue to keep the attorneys at your firm motivated to stay involved and continue to do this, even when it doesn't, the critical need doesn't seem as much when we're outside of, an immediate election?
I think they really like doing these cases. And I sort of mentioned before, we have some partners who champion this work. And so I think their enthusiasm also keeps them, people excited about it. So we have probably a core group of 5 partners now who've been handling these cases, and some of them grew up doing these cases. So they did their first case as an associate and then worked their way to partners. And, as Jonathan and Nancy said, there's a constant flow of cases out there. They might not be as immediate as what appears right now, where we get a call on a Monday and the case has to be filed by Wednesday, but there's a constant flow of issues that arise. So we might not at any given time be holding a docket like we are now of 10 active voting rights cases. At any given time, we have a few. And so people seem to gravitate to them. So it is a non-ending issue, unfortunately. So it's a way to keep people engaged.
Well, and certainly coming out of this election, for those of us who are old enough to remember the 2000 election, I think many of us are looking back on that and not the who is going to win, the red or the blue, but just sort of all the problems with our election administration system that came to the forefront when you have a super close election. I think that coming out of this one, it's going to be a similar review and look back. And so the hope is that we can learn from the things that went wrong. And so another way to get engaged potentially is through, public policy and advocacy, work with your local groups, to work with your state legislature to make positive changes, or even with your local election officials. Virginia made some very positive, just as an example, Virginia made some very positive voting rights changes with this, for this cycle. And I hope those stay in place. And anyway, so that's just something else I wanted to flag, that there will be room for improvement and lessons learned, and we should use that and try to work to make everything work better.
Yeah, thank you for raising that point. A lot of these changes aren't going to be through litigation. It's going to be through policy and other types of advocacy as well. So just as we wrap things up, I'd love to have you share the best places where people can get involved, where they can learn more. If someone is now, really excited to get involved with this work, what, in terms of next steps, what should they do?
So at least for election protection, go to electionprotection.wetheaction.org or protectthevote.net. That's the immediate thing for me. Other folks' suggestions, ideas?
I think one of the best things that attorneys can do, especially as members of their own communities, not just your professional network but your personal networks, is really be a validator for accurate information about the way that your own local elections are administered. So I would just encourage everybody to visit your local county or parish or wherever you live, your county's election officials website, and stay plugged into these issues, not just now during the election cycle, but as we've said, during years when there isn't a major election, and changes are being made, or funding is being allocated to election administrators. I would say just it all starts at the local level, and so I would encourage folks to look at your own backyard and your county election officials.
And I want to give one final plug for being a poll worker and to visit Power the Polls, because that's one way that you not only can get your attorneys and paralegals engaged, but all staff members at the firm engaged. And having not just the lawyers and paralegals and everyone involved just helps build a more cohesive firm and makes everybody feel that they have a stake in this election and can play a role in this election.
And continue to be a poll worker in future elections, not just for this one.
I was just going to say that there's always a need for poll workers, not just now, but always. So it's a good thing to remember. Unless there are any parting thoughts before we close, I want to thank all of our panelists and the DC Bar. This has been a wonderful discussion. I hope that you all are leaving motivated and excited to get involved with voting pro bono. Please consider reaching out to any of us on steps, ways to get more involved. Happy to help with your process, and we hope that this is something that you get involved with. Thank you.
On behalf of the DC Bar and the 2020 Conference Planning Committee, I'd like to thank our speakers for taking the time out of their busy schedules to present on these important topics. As a reminder, please be on the lookout for the email from the CLE staff to submit your codes for credit, as well as to complete the class evaluation. Feel free to send us an email at cle@dcbar.org if you need any help. We look forward to seeing you at future programs, and thank you. Hi, I'm Dennis Cuevas, Director of the CLE program at the DC Bar. We hope you're enjoying this virtual conference marking the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. This session, Unconscious Bias and Its Negative Effects on Women in the Legal Profession, is eligible for CLE credit in all states that have continuing legal education requirements. An alphanumeric code will be read out loud and displayed sometime during the presentation. Please take the time to write down the code. Within the next 24 hours, those of you who have registered and paid for CLE credit will receive an email with a link where you will then identify the correct codes to receive credit. As we enter our busy season with many state CLE deadlines fast approaching, please allow up to 30 days to process your certificate of completion. Also, in that same email, there will be an electronic evaluation form. Please take the time to complete the evaluation. We need a number of them back for accreditation purposes, but more importantly, we review them carefully as we always look for ways to improve our classes. If you have any questions about obtaining CLE credit, please send an email to cle@dcbar.org and we'll be happy to assist you. If you're watching this pre-recorded program during the live broadcast, please feel free to pose any questions you have in the chat room, since our presenters will be available to answer any questions that you have. Now, without any further delay, let me turn it over to our distinguished speakers. Thank you and enjoy the program.
Dennis, thank you for those announcements. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session on unconscious bias and its negative effects on women in the legal profession. I'm Hope Todd, Assistant Director for Legal Ethics for the District of Columbia Bar. 100 years after the 19th Amendment, and decades after women entered law school in equal numbers to men, women in the legal profession continue to face unequal treatment in all aspects of employment due to unconscious bias. This bias can adversely affect their ability to advance and succeed in the legal profession. Today's class will explore the concept of unconscious bias, what it is, and how it affects day-to-day decisions in the legal workplace affecting women. I'm delighted to introduce to you our distinguished faculty, Germán Gomez, Assistant General Counsel to Hogan Lovells in Washington, D.C. Germán helps clients navigate the complexity of compliance with professional responsibility, legal ethics, and conflict of interest rules and regulations related to the daily practice of law in both law firms and in-house legal departments. He also advises clients on issues affecting diverse workforces and specifically focuses on training professional staff on the negative effects of implicit bias during engagement, management, and promotion of employees. Prior to joining Hogan Lovells, Germán served as Assistant General Counsel with the General Counsel's Office of the Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys of the United States Department of Justice, where he provided advice and counsel on the interpretation and application of federal employment laws and regulation. In addition to being a lawyer, Germán obtained his master's in HR strategies from Georgetown University in 2014, where his master's thesis topic was the impact of unconscious racial bias in the U.S. workforce. I know you will enjoy his presentation. Germán?
Hope, thank you for that kind introduction. Before we start today, I would just like to state that the views expressed in this presentation are mine only and do not reflect or represent the views of Hogan Lovells. Also, this presentation is intended to provide general information, and it is not to be considered as legal advice for any particular fact situation. I became interested in the topic of unconscious bias when I was writing my thesis at Georgetown. And unconscious bias is basically a cognitive bias that influences our judgment and decision-making process outside of our conscious awareness. So what is cognition? Cognition is generally defined as the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and the senses. The study of cognition and social psychology began in earnest in the early 1900s with Sigmund Freud and his theories on the unconscious and dreams. In the US, social scientists started studying the effects of race bias in the military after World War II, when the military was integrated by President Truman. These studies from the 50s and 40s looked at bias in the performance evaluations of white and black soldiers. More recently, there's been an explosion of research on the topic of unconscious bias. The reason for the explosion of this research is because of computers and big data. Social scientists can now collect large sums of data and draw conclusions and inferences through statistical analysis of that data. Even though outright discrimination is illegal and immoral, and we are moving towards a post-racial society, gender inequities still exist at all levels of society. Researchers are starting to look at other potential factors to explain why these inequities still exist, and some now believe that unconscious, or implicit as it otherwise is known, could be one such factor. Before we start, a couple ground rules. This is a serious topic, and we'll be talking about difficult gender issues. It is not an anti-male presentation. This is an anti-bias presentation. And bias is a human issue that affects all of us. As members of the legal profession, we, all of us, bear collective responsibility to limit bias on the profession and to mitigate its negative effects on the members of our profession. Having said that, it is perfectly fine to be skeptical. And I want you to be skeptical, and I want you to have your own opinion on this subject. In fact, I strongly recommend that you do your own research on this topic. But please, as we go through this presentation, try and keep an open mind. So let's get started. Today, we are going to cover what is unconscious bias. We will look at some studies of unconscious gender bias in the workplace. We will then look at what the impact of unconscious gender bias is on women in the legal profession. And then finally, we'll talk about ABA Model Rule 8.4G, DC Rule 8.4D, and also DC Rule 9.1 with regards to protections that may be available to individuals that are experiencing bias in the workplace. So what is unconscious bias? Well, all of us have unconscious biases. This is not inherently good or bad. Everyone has them. We tend to categorize things to protect ourselves to act more efficiently. However, unconscious bias or preference that can affect the decisions we make and negatively impact the people affected by those decisions. That is the concern. In the workplace, biases affect every area of employment, from hiring to firing and every conversation in between. And potentially, they could be the reason for the lack of gender diversity in the legal profession today. Therefore, being aware of your potential unconscious biases can help you be more deliberate and objective in taking actions that are very important to the careers of junior lawyers and specifically women within our profession. So now let's take a quick look at a short video to see exactly what is going on in our brains at the subconscious levels. In this video, it will discuss how the brain seeks to automate much of what we do to save energy and time.
Our brain requires a great deal of energy to operate, particularly when we have to concentrate and think about something. Problem solving or making a decision not only uses more brain energy, it also can be a slow process. So our brain seeks to conserve energy by developing efficient ways of operating. One way it does this is through conscious and subconscious processing. Our brain seeks to automate much of what we do to save us time and brain energy. These are our brain's subconscious processes. They take care of our basic life functioning, our fight or flight response, and our learned behaviors and habits. We don't really think about these things, they just happen on autopilot or have become second nature. In fact, up to 95% of all our behaviors and reactions happen at the subconscious level. Our subconscious is also involved in the recording and storing of our experiences and knowledge, forming our memories. These are stored in our brain like photos in a picture album, which we can refer back to later. The way we think and feel about these experiences forms a frame around the photo. This is how we give people, objects, or events meaning. Over time, this is how our attitudes develop. For the most part, our subconscious processes help us navigate the world efficiently. Yet sometimes we might develop unhelpful habits or attitudes that prevent us from achieving our goals. This is where more conscious thinking can benefit us. Our conscious processing involves our higher thinking capacity, where we can be more mindful and considered in what we think, feel, and do. We can use conscious thinking to reprogram our subconscious and change our thoughts, attitudes, and habits. While thinking consciously takes more energy, it is how we take greater control of our brain and achieve our goals.
So some key points to remember here. Through subconscious processing, the brain seeks to automate much of what we do to save brain energy and time. Subconscious processes, those that take care of our basic life functions, for example, our fight or flight response and learned behavior habits, happen unknowingly and quickly. For example, we see a tiger, we know we run. We see an apple, we say good, we hungry, we eat. We see hot coffee, we say be careful, it's hot. It happens on automatic pilot and it becomes second nature. We don't really think about these things. Our subconscious thinking helps us navigate the world efficiently. Efficiency is the key goal here. In fact, most of our thinking happens at the subconscious level. As the video said, 95% of it, because it's easier to save time and energy. This automated thinking forms memories, which is how we give people objects and events meaning. This can lead to unconscious biases or preferences. However, efficiency is not always good when it's at the expense of accuracy. Sometimes our own subconscious thinking, in an effort to help us navigate the world more efficiently, causes us to develop unhelpful habits or attitudes about what we see and experience. Therefore, more conscious thinking can benefit us. Higher level thinking, which takes more time and energy and takes greater control of our brains, allows us to be more mindful and considerate of the actions that we take. We need to use conscious thinking to reprogram our subconscious and change our thoughts, our attitudes, and our habits. The key is to slow it down when you're making decisions that affect other people's lives. Researchers believe that unconscious biases are developed through our socialization process, which may come from our upbringing, experiences, peers, religion, culture, media. These associations are generally believed to develop over the course of a lifetime, beginning at a very early age through exposure to direct, which are beliefs, prejudices, which are attitudes, and discrimination, which is actual behavior. They are different from known biases that individuals may choose to conceal for purposes of social and/or political correctness. They are activated involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. They encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments and preferences. And these hidden biases influence our behavior towards others without us realizing it. Everyone is susceptible to unconscious or implicit biases. These two final points are key that we need to be aware of, that these hidden biases can influence our behavior towards others without us realizing it, and that we are all susceptible to it. So because unconscious bias is an automatic process, people are unaware of the fact that they are doing it. And because these biases often affect our understanding, our actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner, it is all the more important that we try to recognize what may trigger them. Here's a list of characteristics that can trigger an implicit or unconscious bias. As you can see, it is a wide variety of characteristics. Remember that these characteristics can trigger both favorable and unfavorable assessments. A bias does not necessarily have to always be a negative bias. There are positive biases that can also affect the decisions that we make. So let's take a look at this list here. For example, if you look at height, studies show that almost 60% of Fortune 500 CEOs are 6 feet tall, yet only 15% of men in the US are over 6 feet. So why is that? Well, social scientists believe that it's because height may be associated with leadership ability and competency and confidence. Another study shows that height, again, a man 6 feet tall or taller, on average, will earn $166,000 more in wages over a 30-year career than someone who's 5'5". Even when you control for age and weight. Now, keep in mind that age and weight are two other characteristics that have a biases, whether positive or negative, associated with them. This is a study that was done at the University of Florida. And the reason that people associated height with being more authoritative and confident was why they came up with this $166,000 difference. On average, there's about $800 a year in elevated earnings for each inch. Gender and race wage gaps exist. As we all know, many studies show that women make on average 30% less than men, and African American men make less than Caucasian men. And even within genders, there is bias. A Queensland University study showed that blonde women's salaries were 7% higher than brunettes. And this list is not exhaustive. There are other characteristics associated with bias, such as family structure, hobbies, sports, smoking habits, food preferences, personality approaches, an accent you may have, even someone that reminds you of a loved one, whether good or bad. The human mind is an automatic associating making machine. It categorizes everything. Because as we saw from the video earlier, it's easier and it saves our brain time and energy. Once formed, categories are basis for normal prejudgment. We cannot possibly avoid this process. Orderly living depends on it. However, the unconscious attribution of a particular quality or unfavorable stereotype of a member of a certain social group to the entire group can be detrimental and have damaging effects. So what I'm saying here is that sometimes one bad experience or event in your life with an individual that meets one of these listed characteristics could potentially poison our views and opinions going forward as it applies to all individuals that have that same characteristics. And because these unconscious biases can affect the decisions we make consciously and our communications with others, awareness of their existence is critical. So we're now going to take a look at some studies that highlight potential unconscious gender bias within the workplace. This first study is a famous study from the 90s that looked back at discrimination against women and specifically hiring practices for women at large US orchestras. In the 70s, the top 5 orchestras in the US had less than 5% women. After acknowledging that a problem existed, the orchestras decided to use blind auditions starting in the late 70s and early 1980s. The candidates that are applying for symphony positions were situated behind a screen on the stage, and they played for the jury so that they could not be seen. Some of the orchestras used the blind auditions for just a preliminary selection of candidates, while others used the blind audition process until the hiring decision was made. By 1980, the number of female musicians selected had doubled to 10%. By 97, the number of female musicians selected was up to 25%. Now, mind you, the only difference that had occurred was that the women were auditioning behind a screen. The size of the orchestras remained the same throughout this period. The types of instruments all remained the same, and the applicant pool remained the same. The use of screen increased by 50% the probability of a woman advancing out of preliminary rounds of an audition. A large number there. The overall effect of the blind auditions has increased orchestras from about 5% representation to now between 40 and 50%. So why is this? Well, research shows that in some instances, that bias was so strong that the sound of a woman's shoes clicking across the stage was enough to influence some jury members, such that aspiring musicians were instructed to remove their footwear before coming onto stage. Today, because of the use of the screen, some of the large symphonies in the US are more equal in numbers. For example, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra now has 61 men and 41 women. The New York Philharmonic, which used to have 0 women, now comprises of 44 women out of the 100 musicians in the orchestra. This next study looks at gender bias in hiring and salary. This is a 2012 study by Yale University researchers, which created a fictional student that was applying for a laboratory manager position. Applications were sent out to 127 randomly selected science professors at top research-intensive universities. Professors were asked to evaluate the candidates for 1, competency, 2, select a starting salary, and 3, identify whether they would be willing to hire and mentor candidate. All of the applications sent out were identical, except that half of the professors received applications from a Jennifer, while the other half received the application from John. The professors that participated in this study were keenly aware of the STEM issues, science, technology, energy, and math, that exists in universities and that exists in science positions. It is a big issue currently in Silicon Valley, where there are more male computer software engineers than female. So understandably, these university professors were keenly aware of the STEM issue, and they were actually looking for hiring female candidates. And in fact, they were reported as wanting to hire a female candidate rather than a male candidate, given this issue with STEM employment of females. And the hypothesis for this study is that scientists have a superior ability to root out gender bias in their labs because they are trained to rigorously reject subjective criteria. So therefore, scientists should not be susceptible to any subjective biases when they are objectively reviewing applications for the laboratory manager position. Let's take a look at the results of this study. So John, the male candidate, was rated 4 out of 7 for competence. His average starting salary was $30,328. He was seen more favorably as someone that the faculty professors would want to hire to be the laboratory manager. And he was also seen more favorably as someone they would be willing to mentor. Jennifer, the female candidate, was rated 3.3 out of 7 for competence. That's almost a full point less. Her average starting salary was $26,508. That's almost 12%, almost $3,000, almost $4,000 less than the male. Now, keep in mind, it was the identical resume sent to the professors at these research universities. Jennifer was seen less favorable as someone they want to hire, and she was seen less favorably as someone they would be willing to mentor. You should know that the gender of the faculty participants did not affect the responses, in that the female and male faculty members were equally likely to exhibit bias against a female student. And interestingly, prior to participating in the study, the faculty participants reported liking females more than male students. However, the results did not reflect this, which shows some form of unconscious hostility towards women. The second bullet point here touches upon the wage gap with men and women. In this experiment, we had identical resumes that went out to these faculty members, and the only difference was the name of the individual applicant on the resume. And for some reason, it resulted in a pay difference of about $4,000. This next study looks at gender bias in performance evaluations. It is from a Fortune magazine study done in 2014, titled The Abrasive Myth Trap: High Achieving Men and Women Are Described Differently in Reviews. So researchers analyzed whether the tone or content in performance evaluations differed based on the employee's gender. A linguist was hired to study the language that was used in the performance evaluations of strong performers. The study included strong performers who received positive reviews with no knowledge of purpose of the study. 248 reviews were analyzed from 180 people. 105 men participated and 75 women. 28 different companies were included in the study, which included large technology corporations, mid-sized companies, and smaller environments. And again, keep in mind that these are top performers. These are the shooting stars of these organizations. Let's look at what the study bore out. So for the performance evaluations of men, 58% of the reviews contained critical feedback. The type of feedback received was heavily geared towards suggestions for additional skills to develop. And the word abrasive did not appear in any of the performance evaluation reviews for males. For women, the story was quite different. 87.9% of the reviews received contained some critical feedback. And the type of feedback included some skill development, but 71 of the 94 reviews included a personality critique. And the word abrasive was used 17 times to describe 13 different women. Keep in mind that the word abrasive did not appear in any of the reviews of the male candidates, but only for the females. Again, research shows that we apply different standards when we compare men and women. And keep in mind that the majority of these performance evaluations were positive, and the groups were considered high performers in their professional area. But keep in mind that the women's feedback received included personality criticism that the men did not receive. Criticisms such as watch your tone or stop being so judgmental. These type of evaluation critiques appeared for women evaluations and not for men evaluations. Study conducted by Maya Sen at the Harvard Center of American Political Studies looked at race and gender bias in the judicial nomination process for federal judges. Specifically, she looked at the ABA ratings given to the candidates for the federal judgeships. The ABA currently awards 3 possible ratings: 1 well qualified, 2 qualified, or 3 not qualified. This study looked at district court judges because it had a larger sample of 1,652 compared to 9 justices serving the Supreme Court and approximately 180 judges serving the U.S. Court of Appeals, so a total of 190. Because of the ABA's criteria of professional competence looks to previous academic and professional accomplishments, the researcher looked at whether each judge had 1, legal clerkship, 2, had worked in private practice, 3, full-time law professor or dean, 4, worked as a congressional counsel, 5, was an attorney at the Department of Justice or a prior judge, 6, whether the candidate was a former U.S. attorney or assistant U.S. attorney, and finally, the researchers also looked at other experience within the other judicial capacity experience in the past for each candidate. Of the 874 judges in service as of 2008, 24% were women, 10% were Black, 7% were Hispanic, fewer than 1% were Asian American, and no federal judge self-identified as Native American. The findings suggested that women and minority judicial candidates systematically received lower qualification ratings from the ABA than for white males. And this was the case even when comparing nominees with similar pedigrees, including similar education achievements, political ideology, professional experiences, age, and demographic characteristics. And this is what the key issue is with this study. We are looking at an apples to apples comparison. We're not looking at a female judge and a male judge that had different qualifications. We are looking at apples to apples comparison of a male judge applicant with the same or very similar characteristics and background as that of a woman. Regardless of that, women judicial nominees were on average 24% less likely to receive a high rating from the ABA than similarly situated men. Similarly, women judicial nominees were also more likely to receive the lower 2 ratings awarded by the ABA than similarly situated men. Again, the gender bias issue here is the different evaluation of the performance of women as opposed to men. This next study looks at the interruption of judges in the courtroom. There's been prior research in linguistics and psychology that has shown that women are routinely interrupted by men, whether it's a one-on-one conversation or in groups, either at work or in social situations. Interruptions are attempts at dominance, and so the more powerful a woman becomes, the less often she should be interrupted. However, that is not the case at the Supreme Court. This 2017 study examined the transcripts of 15 years of Supreme Court oral arguments. And the study showed that male justices interrupt female justices approximately 3 times as often as they interrupt each other during oral arguments. Even though female justices are some of the most powerful individuals in the country in the legal profession, given their position, they still find themselves consistently interrupted, not only by their male colleagues, but also by their subordinates, the male advocates who are attempted to persuade them. As more women joined the Supreme Court, the male justices increased their interruptions of the female justices. It wasn't as if the percentage of interruptions remained constant. In 1990, when Sandra Day O'Connor was the only justice on the Supreme Court, 35% of the interruptions were directed at her. In 2002, when Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg joined the court, 45% of the interruptions were directed at the 2 female justices. So the percentage of interruptions against the females increased. By 2015, almost 66% of all the interruptions on the court were directed at the 3 female justices on the bench at that time. So with more women on the court, the situation only seems to be getting worse as they are subject to more interruption by their male colleagues. This here is a graph that shows the number of times individual justices are interrupted. And as you can see here, Justice Sotomayor appears to be interrupted the most of all the other justices on the Supreme Court. And you have to wonder whether or not the fact that in addition to being a female, Judge Sotomayor is Latina, and whether or not that is the reason why she gets interrupted more, not just by her male colleagues on the Supreme Court, but also by the males that are arguing before the court. And as you can also see from this chart, in terms of the male-female differences of appellants, lawyers that argue before the Supreme Court, the red bars are male attorneys, and the aqua blue bars are the female attorneys. So you can see that there's also a big difference in what gender argues cases before the Supreme Court. So this is a very instructive chart here. This next study shows the difference between gender and showing anger. There have been past studies that have established that showing emotion in various situations hurts women, while at the same time benefits men in business meetings. This 2018 Arizona State University study suggests that women lawyers are more likely to be judged in a harsher light than men when they display assertiveness, self-promotion, or anger. The survey asked male and female lawyers whether they felt free to express anger at work when it's justified, whether they are rarely interrupted at work, and whether they felt penalized for the assertive behavior. The answers differed based on gender and oftentimes race as well. 56% of white men felt free to express anger, compared to only 40% women of color and 44% of white women. 66% of men said they were rarely interrupted, compared to 50% of women. The results didn't differ by race. And 62% of white men said they are not penalized for being assertive, compared to only 46% of women of color and 48% of white women. The study shows that gender bias skews the way people perceive an attorney's effectiveness in the courtroom when expressing anger. People find angry male attorneys more effective than angry female attorneys. People tend to see male lawyers as powerful when they express anger during a closing arguments, but they describe women as being shrill. This is a great cartoon from the New Yorker that demonstrates how a king or queen's decision to behead an individual is perceived. It's quite funny. So, what is the impact of this bias on women in the legal profession? And why does it matter? Well, the reason why it matters and is so important is because everyone possesses these unconscious associations that affect our decisions, behaviors, and interactions with others. These biases can have harmful effects when they influence our decision making. Keep in mind, of all the studies we just went through, think about potential how someone's going to evaluate an individual who's deemed to be abrasive, as opposed to wearing their emotions on their sleeve, or a female who shows some assertiveness and is perceived as being anger, while a male who shows assertiveness is perceived as being a good sign as a leader. And think of the list of characteristics that can trigger unconscious biases. And now you add that unconscious filter to apply to the decisions we make every day within the workplace. Decisions we make in recruiting and interviewing candidates. Decisions we make with regards to hiring and starting salary decisions. Decisions we make with regards to giving job assignments and what training we give individuals. The decisions we make with regards to giving job performance and evaluation reviews. Decisions regarding promotion, and even decisions regarding as to who we fire or who we include in a reduction in force. And think about the studies we just reviewed on gender bias and how each one of these studies potentially can implicate each one of these decisions that we make within the legal profession. And you start to wonder and think whether or not these biases may be what's causing the inequities within our legal profession with regards to gender diversity and also race diversity, which we're not covering today, but which are also impacted by biases. In the workplace, bias can affect every area of the employment life cycle. And you can start to see why we have an issue that can dramatically impact all organizations. And unfortunately for all of us, these forces are invisible and we're not aware in the moment that they are occurring. So you ask yourself, well, how really does this bias affect the long-term career of an individual? So someone got one bad review and the word abrasive was found in it, or someone's starting salary was a couple $1,000s less than another, or someone was viewed differently because of anger they showed in a meeting as opposed to a male. Really, does that matter? Does that really affect the ultimate career of a professional, of a lawyer, of a woman who studied hard and is trying to become a partner and someday lead a law firm. Here's an example of how these biases play out over the course of a career. In 2014, I was fortunate to attend a presentation given at the Department of Justice by University of Michigan professor Scott E. Page. And the presentation was entitled Leveraging Difference. And according to Dr. Page, unconscious bias has an enormous effect on people's careers. And he believes that it is extremely important for managers to attempt to counter unconscious biases. And to show how damaging biases can be to a career, Dr. Page used as an example a hypothetical Fortune 500 company. And that company hires 20,000 employees per year. Now, that's not a large number for Fortune 500 companies. Many corporations hire that and more in the course of the year. And in this particular example, half were men and half were women. So of the 20,000 employees hired, 10,000 were men and 10,000 were women. The rate of promotion is 60% for men and 50% for women at every level. Not a big difference, right? 10 little percentage points. Half of the women are promoted and only 60% of the women are promoted. And 60% of the men are promoted. Assume 12 promotion levels from the mailroom to the CEO boardroom. And this is what happens. 36 men and 5 women remain. And that is what every corporate boardroom, whether it's profit or nonprofit, looks like in the US today. So a small bias can result in a huge impact for an organization and specifically for a woman's career. So why does bias matter? Even though 50% of all law school graduates since the mid-'80s have been women, they still only represent 20% of law firm partners. Studies show that men are 5 times more likely to make partner than women, even when you control for other factors, including law school grades and time spent out of the workforce or on part-time schedules. Recent study found that 35% of female lawyers have been sexually harassed at work, and 70% of female lawyers reported hearing sexist comments, stories, or jokes at work. The study also found that 77% of female harassment victims never reported the incident. Again, another potential bias where a woman cannot report misconduct that's occurring for the fear of retribution. This is a striking figure. Women represented approximately 41% of all attorneys who left firms in 2018 and 47% of all departing associates. So think about that. Think about the fact that only about 20% of law firms have women representation, but yet double that amount are leaving every year. So by the time that you're looking for equity partnership, you see a firm with equity partnership levels that do not have as many women as men. Women of color even have worse experiences. According to a 2018 report that was prepared for the ABA's Commission on Women in the Profession and the Minority Corporation Counsel Association, women of color experience prove it again bias at a higher percentage than any other group. And 67% of women of color report being held to higher standards than their colleagues. 53% of women of color report that they had equal access to high quality assignments compared to 81% of white men. So women of color have to deal with both the gender bias and then the additional bias of their race. Gender bias in pay is still a big issue. Women in law firm partners earn about 30% less than male law firm partners. A recent study just came out that male equity partners in major law firms saw an increase of 42% in their overall compensation over the past decade, while female equity partners saw a 22% growth. So how do you account for that? I'm sure there are many variables, but could it be possible that performance evaluations is one? Could it be possible that bias is related to how a woman's work is evaluated or assessed, may be affecting the potential evaluation she received and the potential bonuses and promotions that individual female attorneys received? And it's not just a US problem, it's a global problem in the industrialized Western world. In Australia, the legal profession has a gender pay gap of over 25%. According to this study from 2019, Workplace Gender Equality Agency in Australia, barristers have the highest pay gap of any occupation in Australia. The average income for female barristers was $70,000, while the males was double, almost triple what a woman makes. As for lawyers, females made $112,000 on average, while males made $148,000. Women made up only 25% of partners at firms and only about 10% of the most senior positions at those firms. Think about Dr. Page's example of a Fortune 500 company and what happens after 12 promotion levels. At each point, it was only a small difference in terms of who got promoted between males and females. But yet, at the end of the day, only a small percentage of women were still surviving at the C-suite level. The same goes for senior leadership positions at law firms. In the 2019 study in the United Kingdom, found that unconscious bias was the biggest blocker to gender parity. That was a report done by the Law Society in the UK. That study surveyed about 7,700 lawyers from around the world and held roundtable discussions with an additional 700 lawyers. 52% of the respondents said that unconscious biases are the main barrier to women's career progression in the law, and just 11% said that their organizations offer consistent training to recognize and tackle this problem. Why does bias matter? Well, let's take a look at these statistics. In the US, 80% of arbitrators are white males. Again, keep in mind that since the 80s, since the 1980s, over almost 40 years, 50% of the law school graduates in the United States have been women. Yet 80% of arbitrators are males, white males. 76% of lead counsel in civil cases are men. 87% of lead counsel in class actions, again, men. Keep in mind that for the last 40 years, women have been graduating at 50% levels at the law schools in the United States. So how does this bias potentially impact the workplace? Well, in several ways. The impact is negative, to say the least. There could be tangible results with regards to bias in hiring, in who gets fired, in the training, in the wages. Think of the wage gap. In the evaluation, think of the Fortune 500 study, in the evaluation of the top performers of organizations. And then think of promotions. Think about the individuals that decide who gets promoted, and then they start thinking about these personality critiques of individual females that bear nothing on the work product, but that are considered in the promotion process. Well, we can't promote Susie because, she's a little rough around the edges and she's abrasive, as opposed to Bob, who is a leader and wears his emotions on his sleeve, and he would make a strong leader for this firm. So think about how men and women are assessed in that process. Another negative impact is the lack of diversity. You saw the study that shows that about 46 to 47% of all departures from law firms are women every year. So where does that lead gender diversity in most law firms after 4, 5, 6 years? And then there's the lasting disadvantages in career growth. That is the problem we're discussing here today, and the promotion of individual careers and how these biases, whether small or not, can severely affect the career progression of female lawyers within the legal profession. So what are some of the intangible negative effects in the workplace? Well, there's exclusion, feeling not part of the club, low morale. Low morale could be destructive to an organization. High turnover. I know that from studying HR at Georgetown that hiring an individual becomes very expensive, especially partners and especially lawyers. It's very expensive. And if you've got high turnover, you're investing a lot in your personnel, but if you're not taking care of the issues within the workplace, it's going to cost you if there's high turnover. Distrust of management and distrust of firm leadership, another intangible. Unwritten rules. People who go and show up to work, and the unwritten rules are the ones that govern, in spite of the fact that individual firms may say that we promote women and that we are a egalitarian firm. The unwritten rules may say otherwise. Damaged reputations. Lack of innovation. There are numerous studies that say that a diverse workforce are more innovative and more productive than those that are homogenous. So you lose innovation when you lose diversity within your organization. So to summarize the problem, social cognitions that underlie biases, which are stereotypes, prejudices, and discrimination, often operate implicitly and unconsciously. These unconscious biases have the potential to impact the decisions that managers make during the employment life cycle. The employment life cycle includes hiring, salary selection, training selection, performance evaluation, who gets fired, who gets retained. This in turn impacts personnel decisions related to professional development and career advancement in the legal profession. Women in the legal profession continue to face unequal treatment in all aspects of employment due to these unconscious biases. And these biases adversely affect the ability to advance and succeed within the legal profession. So addressing these unconscious biases on multiple levels, not just the individuals, not just the awareness that we should all have within the workplace to try and combat these biases, but also at the institutional level, is critical for achieving fairness and equity in the legal profession. So now let's take a look at ABA Model Rule 8.4G, DC Rule 8.4D, and DC Rule 9.1, and see whether they can be implicated by biased behavior, which occurs during interactions with clients, opposing counsel, court, or others within the workplace. After 2 years of intensive study and debate, in 2016, the ABA adopted Model Rule 8.4G. And the new black letter provision replaces the existing common language and extends the misconduct to practice of law and not just the administration of judgment. Specifically, Model Rule 8.4G states that it is professional misconduct for a lawyer to, G, engage in conduct that the lawyer knows or reasonably should know is harassment or discrimination on the basis of race, sex, religion, national origin, ethnicity, disability, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, or socioeconomic status in conduct related to the practice of law. Under new comment 4 of the ABA Model Rule 8.4G, it states conduct related to the practice of law includes representing clients, interacting with witnesses, co-workers, court personnel, lawyers, and others while engaged in the practice of law, operating or managing a law firm or law practice, and participating in bar association, business, or social activities in connection with the practice of law. Lawyers may engage in conduct to undertake to promote diversity and inclusion without violating this rule by, for example, implementing initiatives aimed at recruiting, hiring, retaining, and advancing diverse employees or sponsoring diverse law student organizations. This has been a very contentious change, and there have been arguments from many sides about the fact that this rule potentially infringes upon lawyers' First Amendment rights. I implore you to do your research on this, because I think you'll see that in many of the laws of professional conduct, some of our constitutional rights are implicated because we are governed by the rules of professional conduct. And in many instances, those rules touch upon constitutional rights, but do not make those rules unconstitutional. How does the ABA help the legal profession? Well, it helps the profession with the public perception. It helps lawyers also with clear definitions and parameters of what is prohibited. Even though some of this conduct is already prohibited by law, it ties it in with conduct within the workplace. It sets out guidelines and comments to protect the operation of law practice and the right of free speech, thought, and association as well. A lot of that was taken into consideration when this particular rule was adopted. It limits its application to conduct related to law, which allows for maintaining focus on just specifically actions taking place within the practice. So why more jurisdictions should adopt it? Well, lawyers, judges, clients, and public would benefit with the legal system as being fair and unbiased. And that's really the purpose of the rule. The purpose of the rule is to address these biases, to make the legal system fairer for everyone who practices within that system. Lawyers should always be engaging in conduct that promotes the good of the profession. And these provisions assist lawyers in complying with this goal when they are engaged in the practice of law and in business. Recently, in July of 2020, the ABA came out with a formal ethics opinion, which explains Model Rule 8.4G. And it provides a specific instruction as to what is covered and what is forbidden under the rule. I recommend, it's part of the materials that are provided for this presentation, so I recommend that you please review that ABA ethics opinion. 8.4D in DC addresses conduct within the administration of justice. So what does that mean? It means that a lawyer can violate that rule by offensive, abusive, or harassing conduct that seriously interferes with the administration of justice. Such conduct may include words or actions that manifest bias, prejudice based upon race, sex, religion, national origin, disability, age, sexual orientation, or socioeconomic status. 9.1 in DC addresses discrimination in employment. Under that rule, a lawyer shall not discriminate against any individual in conditions of employment because of the individual's race, color, religion, national origin, sex, age, marital status, sexual orientation, family responsibility, or physical handicap. So that rule addresses specifically discrimination within the hiring of individuals and in conditions of employment. Again, sex and gender is included in that, so that's something that can be implicated in DC.
I'm going to interrupt with the CLE code for our audience. If you have your pen and paper handy, the CLE code for today's class is H as in happy, T as in Todd, 8-4. Again, that's H as in happy, T as in Todd, 8-4. And one last time, HT 8-4. Please write this down. Thank you.
Let's see what we've learned today about gender bias. This is a very famous riddle. A father and his son are in a car accident. The father dies at the scene, and the son, who is badly injured, is rushed to the hospital. In the operating room, the surgeon looks at the boy and says, "I can't operate on this boy. He is my son." How can this be? Let's take a look at this video and see if you can come up with the answer while you watch this video.
Father and son are driving a car. They get into a car accident. The dad dies. The son gets rushed into A&E. Yeah. The surgeon says, "I cannot operate. This is my son." Who's the surgeon? Oh my gosh!
Well, it could be his biological father because he's adopted him.
The father of the boy.
A ghost. A priest.
The surgeon's the dad.
The farmer.
The father died, so yeah, can't be the father. It's down to God to say that.
God.
The wife had an affair with the surgeon. No, there is stepfather or biological father.
His brother. Surgeon's the mother.
Oh my God, yes! It makes so much sense. Damn! Oh, that's so annoying!
That's terrible, isn't it?
Oh.
Yeah, obviously.
Oh my gosh!
Ah, okay.
Oh, yeah, obviously, and we all automatically assume that the surgeon's a man.
Yes, the answer is that the surgeon is the boy's mother. However, for many people, their automatic mental association causes them to think male on reading or hearing the word surgeon. If you didn't say mother, you're not alone. On average, 85% of the respondents have trouble coming up with the mom is the surgeon answer. This riddle reveals potential gender bias. People have difficulty picturing a woman as a surgeon. Often we hear responses like, he had two dads, the mom was divorced, as you saw in the video. Even one where they say the boy is an illegitimate son of a Catholic priest. Again, all that just to fit the stereotype that surgeons are males. In 2014, a study was done at Boston University that gave this exact riddle to a group of 197 Boston University psychology students and 103 summer campers from a nearby summer camp. And the results were the same. Only 15% of the children were able to select the mom is the surgeon answer, and only 14% of the BU psychology students could do so. So as of 2014, the stereotype still persists. So basically, we have a lot of work to do still. And with that, I end my presentation. Are there any questions? Well, great. Thank you for that. And I hope that this presentation was informative. And if you have any specific questions, please feel free to email me or call me, and we can discuss this issue further. Thank you so much for your time.
On behalf of the DC Bar and the 2020 Conference Planning Committee, I'd like to thank our speakers for taking the time out of their busy schedules to present on these important topics. As a reminder, please be on the lookout for the email from the CLE staff to submit your codes for credit, as well as to complete the class evaluation. Feel free to send us an email at cle@dcbar.org if you need any help. We look forward to seeing you at future programs, and thank you.